You are listening to the Information Security Notes and Podcast, episode 18, originally released on July 31st, 2020. My name is Amishav. This week we have Simon Bennetts on the show. Simon created the OWASP ZAP proxy, which is probably the world's most popular web scanner. One of the great things about ZAP is the degree to which you can automate tasks, both from a API perspective to run headless scans and embed it within your CI/CD process, but also the ease in which you can extend the built-in functionality to do what you want via a multitude of languages. I learned a lot from this interview, so I hope you do as well. Direct support for this podcast comes from BreachSense, the data breach monitoring platform. What's the easiest way hackers break into your network? By using validated usernames and passwords. Hackers collect millions of leaked credentials from almost daily data breaches. Without visibility into which of your employees or users' credentials have been leaked, it's tough to protect against this. Integrate BreachSense's powerful yet easy-to-use API into existing security solutions to prevent account takeover and stop online fraud. Hey, Simon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Josh. It's great to be here.
All right. Well, thanks for coming. Can we start with, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into AppSec?
Sure. 10, 11 years ago, something like that, I was a developer, Java developer, and actually team leader as well. So I led a small Java team. We were developing web services for a fairly significant FTSE 100 UK company, fairly international as well actually now. And one of the services we were developing was considered security critical. So we kind of planned the security from the start. But I insisted that they get an external penetration test done on it. And, we got the pen testers in. I think it was fairly unusual at the time, at least for this company. So there was a bit of nervousness around that, and they were put in a separate room. But I kind of treated them as part of the team. So, I wanted them to find anything that could be problematic for us. So I told them everything I could about the service, gave them test accounts. And I remember, walking into the room after an hour, just to see how they're getting on, if they had any questions, and only to see that one of the pen testers was logged into the administration console with my credentials. They had super user access, which they hadn't been given. So this was a little bit of a wake-up call. And in this particular case, that wasn't my code that found vulnerabilities in. They just cracked the entire company's single sign-on system. So that was like, oh my God. And, they delivered this report at the end of the week, and it looked like a car crash. I've now found out that actually it wasn't too bad, and I've delivered much more damning reports myself. But at the time, it was like, oh my God, this is terrible. And, as a proud developer, I really wanted to make sure that the services I developed had all the functionality they required, were, easy to use or as usable as they needed to be, were highly performant, they were robust, and they were secure. And at the time, I thought I knew enough about security. And after this pen test, it was clear I didn't know enough. So, there were some vulnerabilities. There was a cross-site scripting vulnerability slipped through. We knew about those. That was annoying. But there was cross-site request forgery. I'd never heard of that. I'd never had any security training. That was new to me. And I remember talking to one of the pen testers saying, yeah, but this is an admin console, and it's behind it's not external outside. Visibly outside, so that can't be attacked, can it? It was like, oh yes, with the cross-site request forgery, we can attack it from outside, and he showed me how, and it's like, okay, I need to learn more about security. So it was very much, I wanted to learn about security to help me deliver applications that were suitably secure. That was the reason I started learning about security, and I hadn't heard of OWASP, I had to admit. So I started going through the top 10 and the OWASP testing guide, developer's guide, those great documents. But I'm a developer, so I love playing around with tools. And I wanted to learn hands-on, and I wanted to find a tool that I could use to help me secure my services, ideally in an automated way, so these things like these silly cross-site scripting vulnerabilities wouldn't get through, so I wouldn't be embarrassed at the next pen test. So that's really how I started off on my security journey.
Well, okay. So, and then at that point, you based ZAP on Paris, right?
Yeah. So I started, I'm a developer. I like tools. So I started playing around with security tools. I was picking the free open source ones. So OWASP had Web Scarab, but I didn't really get on with Web Scarab. I didn't, for some reason, it just didn't click with me. Whereas Paros, I found, if I was nice and simple, I could understand what was going on. and it did everything I needed to do. So I played around with that and started using that to see what was going on. And I thought, it had potential, but there were some things that annoyed me, just little things. There was one menu. I think you could open a request in the manual request editor from either the sites or the history tree, but not the other way around. And that just kind of annoyed me. So I remember thinking, well, I'm a Java developer. This is written in Java. Pulled it into Eclipse. And I still remember making that change and firing my change version of Paros up and going, there's a new menu item and it works. So I was very much doing server-side Java. I've never really I didn't really think of Java as a client-side. I thought the whole applet thing was a really bad idea. But even Java desktop apps, I hadn't really much experience with. So the whole swing thing was new to me. But it was, I got it, I managed to make a change and this is great. So I then started, delving into code to try and work out how it was doing things. But I also started giving talks to other developers and functional testers who I worked with. So it was clear they didn't know much about security either. And the first question they asked me was, which tools should we use? So I thought, okay, I'll do this properly. I'll go around and see if I can find the right tool to recommend to them. So I wanted a tool that's open source. I wanted it cross-platform because most of them were Windows devs and I was using Linux. I wanted it to have the key functionality, but didn't have to be too complicated. And ideally, I wanted something that was supported, that had a community around it. And I was also looking to get into open source, and I wanted to find a community, an open source, a community-based open source project I could get involved with and learn about. And I thought, well, security seems to be something I could, really good to get into. So that's what I was looking for, a security project which I could contribute to. But I couldn't find one. The only tool, the closest tool that seemed useful was Paros, or this version of Paros I was hacking around with. So I thought, okay, I'm going to bite the bullet. I will fork Paros. I called it ZAP, and I released it. And I created this user sign-on with no apparent connection to myself because I didn't know whether what I was doing would be, had legal problems or whether the security community would laugh at me or whatever for, to having the temerity to release a tool which was, a security tool with knowing very little about security at the time. And I did actually, I think the initial tagline was the security tool for developers. But that's how I ended up releasing ZAP and offered it to OWASP and it got accepted. So it became OWASP ZAP.
Wow. Okay. And let's fast forward. Today, there's a tremendous amount of automated functionality within ZAP, both using it as a desktop tool and also via the APIs. Can you tell us a bit about how pen testers could use ZAP as part of their testing?
Definitely. I mean, I think the whole automation thing was something I was very keen on at the start. As I said, I wanted an automated way to pick up the simple things like cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. And I think one of the key things is when you're doing testing, the best way to test something is still going to be the manual pen test. Somebody who knows what they're doing, the right tools, is always going to be more effective than automation. However, it takes time and it takes experience. And there's, automation can be automated, and also it gives you coverage. So I think one thing you can use is really good for automation is if you've got a new application and you're just getting started with it, then use automation to get an understanding of the application, to get that the overall initial impression. Find out what it, you need to test it manually, but the automation can find the simple things. If you find a load of, SQL injection and cross-site scripting vulnerabilities with automation, then, you can understand that this is an application that's fairly early on in its security maturity, but it allows you to get to just test, you get the coverage and allows you to actually make sure that you're hitting everything and finding everything. Because, even though you can search things manually, but obviously you need the automation in order to be able to find things that aren't referenced anywhere or shouldn't be referenced anywhere. So I think that's a key point.
If you're testing an app that requires authentication, would a pen tester would they have to first proxy all the requests through a browser to be able to capture the session tokens? Are there ways to automate things like this via the command line? How would they approach this?
So authentication is a pain. It always is, or probably always will be. So, what I tend to recommend is if you're in an environment where you can turn off authentication, That's great for automation, because authentication is a pain, and in many cases you're trying to automate the testing of authentication, and whatever you do, there's a danger of being a bit fragile. When you're doing manual pen testing, yes, you can definitely. The easiest way is probably proxying your traffic through ZAP. And ZAP, we can launch browsers. We've been able to do this the last 5 years or something. So you can launch Firefox, you can launch Chrome. Pretty sure Safari works as well. And that's automatically going to proxy through ZAP and accept the ZAP certificate or ignore certificate warnings. So I think when you're doing manual pen testing, the authentication is something that's kind of less of a problem, really, because you can do it manually, you can see what's going on. But if you do want to automate, then that becomes more interesting. So we have, the ZAP API support it's very powerful. You can do pretty much everything you can do via the UI, you can do via the API. It's not always the easiest thing to configure, but what we can do is you can set up an application. We have these things called contexts, which are just, you can think of them as applications, but they are a way of associating properties with parts of the sites you're testing. So you set up a context and you can configure ZAP to understand how to authenticate. And then you can save that. And then if you want to do any automation around it, you can just load that context and get going straight away without having to use all the API calls. We've got API calls for setting up all the individual aspects of authentication, but you can do it much more quickly with the context. The other thing is we often find that applications where they do weird things, they've got weird authentication, got weird session handling, and ZAP has pretty good support for the standard ways of handling sessions authentication. But one of ZAP's strengths is its scripting. So we have scripts that run within ZAP, and they run with full ZAP permissions, and they are tightly embedded into ZAP. So you can actually run scripts at a whole load of different times as part of authentication, as part of spidering, as part of active scanning, passive scanning. So you can essentially rewrite ZAP on the fly.
And can you give an example?
Yeah, sure. I mean, things like, authentication and session handling. We've got, you can choose your standard things like your, say, HTTP auth or form-based auth, but you can implement a script-based authentication. And what we then have is we have template scripts which have all these methods in, and then you can implement those methods so you can tell ZAP exactly how to act when it comes across this type of authentication. So you're rewriting ZAP, you're rewriting ZAP within ZAP, because we've got a script console within there. So you're actually doing it live. It's, you don't have to have an IDE. You don't have to, go through this complex process. The scripts run, from ZAP. You can change them with ZAP. You can debug them in ZAP. It means that ZAP is, I said, you can just rewrite ZAP on the fly. And because ZAP is open source, you have access to all the ZAP functionality. There's nothing hidden. You have access to all the data sources within ZAP. If you ever find anything that you can't access easily from scripts, then let us know and we'll make it happen, because we've got nothing to hide. And we've got a whole load of examples. So we've got a community scripts repo where people have got a lot of different examples in there, which we're adding to all the time. So hopefully, if you come across some weird situation, you'll find either a script which already handles it, or you'll find, something which will give you, something you can base off, and you can start implementing your own custom scripts.
Well, okay. And what language if you want to interact with ZAP, does that have to be done in Java, or are there other options?
No. So scripting languages, by default, we have JavaScript and a language called Zest out of the box. I'll talk about Zest in a bit. But we've got Python, we've got Ruby. There's actually a whole load of them. There's I'd have to check online, but we've got quite a few there's about half a dozen different scripting languages, and it's actually not too difficult I think someone's working on one of the Stackle guys is working on a Kotlin scripting language. So Java's got pretty good support for scripting languages. So JSR 223 or something like that, server scripting languages, supports that definition in Java. We can pull it into ZAP quite easily. So it's very powerful. And the one which is the fun one, and one's a bit different, is a scripting language called Zest. And that's something we came up with, but it's kind of it's a graphical scripting language. So it's a bit like a templating language, but it's incredibly powerful. So it's got conditionals in, it's got loops in, but you can record Zest scripts, and it's very much focused on automation and security. So you can record requests and you can manipulate them very easily. So it's something that I found very powerful. We haven't documented it well enough. I need to do some more videos on how to use it properly, more documentation. But Zest is it's a fun language to learn, and it's you can do really powerful things with it. Yeah, I mean, you can actually, so a lot of the Zest stuff is about making requests and manipulating them, but you can also launch browsers. So you can launch browsers and click on elements. So I did a workshop recently for All Day DevOps, and I went through explaining how to set up authentication with OWASP JuiceShop, which is a vulnerable web app, which is really fun to play with. I can strongly recommend that to people. But so we had form-based authentication, which I handled with the standard ZAP scripting, but then there's Google authentication as well, so essentially a single sign-on. And in order to solve that, I then launched browsers from within ZAP and clicked on elements in order to do the authentication. So, if there's a form of authentication, and you can automate it, you will be able to automate it via ZAP.
How did you get past the token, though, after it changes after 30 seconds?
So basically, you're essentially just clicking on, you're launching a browser and you're clicking through the standard Google authentication, and then we're picking up the token, and then we're using that within ZAP. So it's all
okay.
Yeah,
very cool.
We can automate anything in ZAP.
So back to that original question, we could basically use Zest then to create go through whatever steps you need to do to authenticate, save that as a script, and then just replay that and automate
exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, very cool. And then if folks want to add their own automated tests, so would they use Zest for that, or they can write that in Python? How would they do that?
It all depends. So Zest, you can do things very quickly. Just like if a response contains a certain thing, and some, we've got all the kind of logic stuff around that. So one advantage of Zest is you don't have to remember any syntax because it's all graphically based. So if you can do it via the GUI, then it'll run. Whereas obviously if you want to write something in JavaScript or Python, you've got to get the syntax right. But if you're used to Python or JavaScript or Ruby, then use those. They're probably, that's what you're familiar with, so and if you're doing anything complex, I would definitely go down the standard scripting language route. But if you're doing something quickly and you just want to do some fairly standard things, or maybe extract tokens and stuff, Zest has a whole load of things which are really useful and just aimed at manipulating requests. So that's what it's there for. But yeah, you can write your own passive scan rules, you can write your own active scan rules. We actually have passive scan rules for WebSockets now as well, so you can write those in any scripting languages too.
Wow. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is HUD, which is basically a paradigm shift for pen testers. Instead of having to jump between the browser and then the proxy, it puts it all within the browsers and continue testing. Can you tell us a bit about how you came up with that, where that's headed? Is that going to be the focus for the tool going forward?
Sure. So the HUD, I think we came up with the idea years ago, a long time ago. And it really came out of, so there's two different aspects of it. One is I've been concerned that people are new to security, find the tools quite overwhelming. We try to make the ZAP desktop easier to use and less going on, but even so, there's quite a lot going on. As soon as you start right-clicking everywhere, there's a million options, and they're all context-sensitive, so it's complex. And the other thing is, I've also been concerned that pen testers sometimes focus on their tools too much, which sounds weird coming from someone who writes a pen test tool. But one of the things I think is that a lot of the really fun vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities in the application logic rather than in the pure requests and responses. So if you just look at the requests and responses, you play with if you're in your security tool too much, you're focusing on the traffic as opposed to what the application is trying to do. And I think it's important to get under the skin of the application to understand what it's trying to do and how it's doing it, and then attacking the logic of the application. And for that, you need to be in the application. You can't just be in your security tool. So the whole idea of the HUD is that we want people to be in the application more of the time. So we want people to actually explore the application, to use the application you're testing, but then to have security information kind of given to you, it's around the edge. It just tells you what's going on. And then if you want to delve into more details, you can do that. And you can do, there's fun things like we will show you when there are hidden fields, and you can just make them visible and editable with a click of a button. And the really fun one is the break, where you can actually essentially break and intercept and change requests on the fly in your browser. You don't need to keep on switching between your browser and your security tool. You can kick off the spidering, the active scan. We can go into attack mode. So ZAP essentially follows you around and attacks things. And it generally decorates the application so you can see where potential security vulnerabilities are and tells you that a bit more about the application. And this is not a replacement for the ZAP desktop or any other kind of heavyweight security tools, but it's there so that allows you to focus on the application while with the security mindset and doing some basic security testing. But you still are going to need to be able to do all the hardcore fuzzing and things like that. So actually, I've got quite a fun demo that I've done once where I had ZAP running, and we know that there are a lot of pen testers out there who use Burp a lot. So I actually had ZAP running in daemon mode, proxying through Burp, but with the HUD turned on. So you've got your browser and it's got the ZAP HUD, and you can then do all of the stuff with ZAP, but we're still proxying all the traffic through Burp. And ZAP is taking all the HUD stuff out, so Burp doesn't see that. So you can actually play with the application in your browser, see what's going on, do all the fun things in the HUD. And then if you want to do the deep dive with some of the Burp tools you're more used to, then you can still do that in the same session, essentially.
Cool. So if you had something like, let's say, parameter rotation, right? So you're just rotating a numeric parameter and you're accessing other accounts. If you're using the HUD, you would still need to go back into ZAP to be able to automate the exploit for that, correct?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the HUD is still relatively early days. What we try to do is get all the essential things in there. And we're really looking for feedback from people to give us an idea of where we should be taking the HUD. Because I'm not sure whether it's, I'm nervous about putting all of the ZAP functionality in there. It'll take a long time for a start. And I quite like the fact that the HUD is pretty lightweight. So, it'll be very interesting to get feedback from people to see where they would like us to take it. Because that's the key thing, we're trying to do things which people find useful.
Definitely. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I had to play with it and I was trying to figure out the best way for testing, and then your explanation of it just so you can kind of get a feel for the web app without having to go back and forth makes a lot of sense. But then when you want to do some of the, say, business logic type attacks, then you really need to see the actual request to be able to play with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. In terms of, if we can go back to the API scanning. So there were a couple different options to integrate with the API. If you're a developer, what would you suggest is there a preferred method
for scanning APIs or for driving?
Yeah, API? if you wanted to use ZAP to scan your code.
Okay, so I mean, the one thing with developers is I think as soon as you've got an application which is available, that's when it's a really great time to start actually using ZAP. And if you're in the development environment or a QA environment, you can turn off authentication or use more simple authentication rather than you have form-based instead of single sign-on, those kind of things. So we've got a lot of options with automation. The easiest options are probably using the Docker images. So we have a whole load of different Docker images. We've got the stable release, which is 290, ZAP 290. We have a weekly release, so every week on a Monday, we have a new version of the weekly release. We have a live release as well. So, if we make any changes at all to ZAP, then an hour later, there'll be a new live Docker image that people can play with. But with the Docker images, we have what we call package scans. So these are the Docker images are standard ZAP, and you need to drive them with either desktop or the API typically. And so the package scans are just the most common ways we think people will find ZAP useful. So we've got something called a baseline scan, and all that does is a 1-minute spider. You can make it a bit longer if you like, and then does passive scanning. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but it's something which will only take a couple of minutes. So you can put it into your CI/CD type pipeline. So you make a commit, and a couple of minutes later, you can be sure that, well, you haven't forgotten security headers, missing anti-CSRF tokens, those kind of things. So it's very useful to do inline in CI/CD. And it also means you can scan a large number of applications. So when I was at Mozilla, we had a couple, 200 or something applications that I was doing passive scanning on every day. But then we've got the active scan. So that is where we're doing the full spidering, the full active scanning. And then we've got an API scan, which is similar to the active scan, but obviously it's not doing spidering because spidering isn't so effective with APIs, but allows you to import an open API definition. And actually, in addition to the package scans, we've now got the GitHub actions. So we've got both the baseline and the active scan as GitHub actions. And the great thing about these is, this is now running on GitHub's infrastructure. So you're not even paying for the cost of running the scan. And they also can raise issues on the repo that you've put it on. So we've got blog posts about this, and we've actually got, so our zaproxy.org website, we run the API and the full scans on this site, and we've blogged about it, and we've documented exactly how you do it. So it's the GitHub actions are a very quick way to start using ZAP in an automated way. And I think we're the first, probably still the only DAST scanner, dynamic application security testing scanner on GitHub actions, which is pretty cool.
So basically, every time you commit to GitHub, you can run a full ZAP automated scan against the code.
The full one could, if you want, it could take a while. So the baseline might be an easier way to get to do the initial one, but schedule the full scan every night or something like that.
Okay, but the baseline you're getting just high level, like how many? I haven't looked to see what the coverage is, but what should the expectation be from a baseline scan?
So the baseline scan, what we do is we do a 1 minute spider, and if you've got a modern web application, you probably want to use the Ajax spider as well. So the Ajax spider launches browsers to click on elements, so it handles JavaScript much more effectively. With the 1 minute spider, the standard one, I was still picking up, say, 600 or 800 URLs, and we're just passive scanning those. So that's why it's so quick. But it does mean there's a whole load of different types of vulnerabilities, particularly missing security controls that we can pick up. So it's a good sanity check. And it's actually a very good way of, if there's a new application I wanted to look at, a baseline scan just gives you that flavor and gives you an idea of the kind of security controls that developers have put in or haven't put in. And if you're finding a load of things missing, then it's like, okay, we're going to have problems here. And if all the security headers are there and all the pages and the anti-CSRF tokens and the cookies have HTTP only and secure flags, then you have that better, slightly better feeling about it, thinking, okay, the developers are aware of these things. So you start thinking, well, it's going to be a bit hard to compromise this application.
If you wanted input validation, some of the input validation testing, is the app baseline or fully automated, or is there something in between?
You need the full scan for that. Yeah,
full scan for that. Great.
That's what we do with attacking.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. Very interesting development in this space. Okay. If people want to learn more about you, where's the best place to find you?
Well, I'm not very interesting. So learning about ZAP, though, zaproxy.org. So that is our website. And there's loads of some really good API documentation, which was written for us by Google Season of Docs student, Nirajan. It was great because up until now, our documentation, like many open source projects, hasn't been so good. But we're trying to make sure that zaproxy.org has got all the highest quality documentation and the latest stuff for ZAP. So that's the best place to start. And I've done a load of videos in conjunction with All Day DevOps. They're called ZAP in 10. They're linked off the website as well, but they've got their own website. So there's quite a few on there, and I go through 10-minute videos of different ZAP features.
Yeah, and I looked at that for this interview, and there's just so much functionality. They were great, and they were very helpful. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. And that's one thing I think a lot of people don't realize how much functionality is in ZAP. There's a huge amount. We get lots of requests for features, and the answer is, that's already in there. This is how you do it. And it's tricky. We understand that people don't. We try and document everything, but it's not always particularly easy to find, and people don't always want to read all the docs before they get stuck in. So ZAP can do a lot of things. we've got user groups, we've got developer groups. So if you're unsure about something, just pop in there and ask us. We've also got an IRC channel where some of us are on there most of the time. So jump on there and say hi as well. All this is linked off the zaproxy.org website.
Awesome. So that would be the first place to go.
Definitely.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And if you have any questions or feedback, please contact me at podcast@breachsense.io. And if you got value from this, then please share it with a friend. See y'all next week.